Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I am Bud Marr.
And we are, I was going to say we're coming to you live from, but that sounds like you're vanishing and going away.
I like sometimes on the radio to mess with like some of the sound possibilities.
The dynamic sound mansions in time.
When we record, you kind of hover over our little blackboard, and I think there are some cool sound effects. Very peaceful. Not as peaceful.
No, well, any rate, I think those can both work, right? Because you got those are crickets, I guess.
I like that first one. Last year, I convinced myself to download the Calm app. Am I allowed to say like the name of apps on air? They don't support the show,
right?
But it's worked out pretty well. I like it. I don't know if I'm going to renew my subscription, but that little nature montage that you put on there, that kind of reminded me of the Calm app.
How many times are you like playing that in the fourth quarter during like football games or like during baseball games?
No, there's not a strong enough app to heal Husker stress. But sometimes at work, I'll have like the sounds of the rainforest in the background.
I can just imagine like it's, just contention and bedlam and everything like that. But you have your headphones and the birds are helping you settle down a bit.
What's funny is to show how bad I am at capitalism, or just making money, I should say. Like with some of these apps, like the Calm app, really, I think that guy's done very well. And it's kind of just like, it'll just be like this 2-minute thing, like here, like take deep breaths, like 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. And it's like, why couldn't I have come up with that idea? But I guess there is also the logistics of programming the app
there's just
and
that sort
marketing
of
it.
I think the big temptation for me is just to do a Calm app and like 2.5 minutes in, just yell. Just to see what happens. And so that's probably why I too am not rolling in the dough with my entrepreneurial ideas. It is a good idea, though, Bud, is if you are interested in extending the healing ministry of Jesus Christ in the cares of the Sisters of Mercy, you should check out mchs.edu. Mercy College, who underwrites our show, thank you for doing so. mchs.edu, as we said, it is full on fall. It is getting ready to be winter, so that means we're getting done with the fall semester here pretty close, especially with things like Thanksgiving coming along. But that means it's a perfect time, well, not to think about spring, probably too late for that, but a perfect time to think about a summer start, mchs.edu.
Yeah, each season of the academic year has kind of its own feeling and ambiance to it. And we're kind of in the time of year where we meet a lot of prospective students. And last week there was a campus visit day, and you and I got to demo our bioethics course. So we do like a little teaching demonstration. And I think, I'll be honest, like some prospective parents and students, they're like, whoa, like, it's, we don't hold back in our ethics demonstration, but it also reminded me just kind of like the blessing and the high calling of being able to teach at a school that like makes the effort to extend the healing ministry, as you say.
mchs.edu. I do like, every time we've explained that we've done a bioethics demonstration, I think sometimes people think like we waltz people in and there's like a patient bleeding on the table. And we're like, what are you going to do? That's not what we mean. We just sort of do like a snippet of introductory class. But I do like this idea that like we're in full, gear, and like we're just holding the scalpel out at them. That's not what happens.
2 times ago, we had a family where I could tell like the parents' eyes got kind of wide, and I talked to them, and I did try to make sure that I communicated, like, your daughter in the future won't be deciding if a patient gets an organ. Because we talk about some of the...
Well, you never know, but, like, it's not a normal thing.
I was like, Mercy One Medical Center does have an ethics board. So these, like, some of these tough decisions, they happen at the corporate level. Like, there's consensus, and there are people who are trained to consult doctors on these things.
It's like the first day of work.
Because we get into the ethical...
Who lives or dies?
Yeah, I think we get into the ethical dilemmas, and sometimes the new students are like, so I'll have the option to clone a human being? Probably not.
No.
That's good to think through.
Yeah, but speaking of what's good to think through, it is the month of November, and so we're going to talk about the dead, but how that relates to not only politics, but to the common good in general. I know we often think about politics as the thing that the living do, especially since we just got done with an election, but very much how it is that our relationship to the dead plays a relationship to Catholic social teaching and our life as a political animal. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, whether that be through the airwaves on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or iowacatholicradio.com. Then, of course, all of our wonderful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening. It is wonderful to have you with us. Today on the show, we are going to get back to speaking on our topic that we've been rolling along with. It was 8 years in September, right? 8 years in September?
That's right.
Yes, and so we have been going through and reconsidering the Catholic social principles that made up the first run of our shows. Now, to be honest, we've pretty much got through most of those first shows as far as complete reconsiderations. But being that we've been at this 8 years, of course, we have more shows to do because we, I hope, have more topics to talk about. And so one of them that sort of matches up with the time of year, being that it's November, make sure to go out to your graveyards and pray for the dead, pray for your dead loved ones. That starts to be this social obligation that we think is precisely something to throw in for people to contemplate how that is actually a social teaching of the church and not simply sort of this like religious duty on top of everything else. We can even get into religious duties and how they are social as well. But I hope people start to see this, that it sounds like what you do when you think of Catholic social teaching or social teaching in general, that's sort of political stuff you do, or maybe it's even stuff you do, you know, in a neighborly way or a municipal way, you know, elections, these things like this, or it can be, you know, you're nice and you make sure the leaves don't go into your drain and clog up the city system. But, you know, praying for the dead, that's just strictly a private thing you do based on your religious practice. And I think we have gotten a lot of mileage, I think that's the word I'd use, when we have, for instance, introductory classes of different stripes that we've got to teach together, to have people consider how our relationship, our comportment with the dead actually plays a very important foundational role in the life of a polity, of a body politic, and of a community. There's several ways to start this out, but if someone heard me say that, rattle that off, and still had a skeptical eye, what's the first thing you're going to throw out to them about this reality that how we treat the dead and our obligations to the dead have everything to do with the life of the living in community?
Well, one thing that's really jumped out to me in our conversations with students and some of the readings that we've done is how much how well of a job our society has done pushing death to the margins. So, interestingly enough, like if you think about just the sheer population of the human race right now, like we have more deaths around us than humans have had in eons, if ever, right? You know, I mean,
just by the sheer fact of
just
population.
Like the number of people who died in Des Moines today because of its population is more
right
than what it would have been 100 years ago. And yet the experience of that reality is pretty thin for most, like especially young people. So we've talked in our class, like just share your experience of like how often you've been to a funeral, how many funerals you've been to. And whereas our parents, or certainly their parents, like if in their hometown someone had passed, certainly a relative or loved one, there was sort of this social expectation that everyone would be present for the funeral. Today, it's pretty common to talk to students who have maybe been to like one or two funerals in their lives, maybe their grandparents or a close family member. But outside of that, and if they hear that an uncle dies, for not to pick on uncles, but like once you get to that level of the extended family, there's not really that kind of like social expectation that you would be present for the services or slow your life down in any way. Now, so that's kind of like the social reality that we're dealing with. And what we try to point out to our students is like those kind of practices that we've been habituated into influence not only our treatment of the dead, but also our understanding of what life is about. So there's a way in which if you feel like this present moment is all that you have and that you don't feel that tangible connection to generations that have gone before you, that's going to impact in a lot of ways, like your actual ethics and what you think life is about and how it's well lived.
I think that's perfectly said, especially in the lived experience and the sort of crosstalk certain generations sort of living in our cities now are misunderstanding each other. I can see our parents' generation, if any of, we're 40-somethings, but very few of us have grandparents still alive. But if we sort of do, like my last great aunt passed away last year, but you start to think that they remember being formated in the years, like they could have been kids that would be going to, like, so, Veterans Day is not happened very recently. They could have been going to services for the first veterans who died in World War II, right? Like that was their childhood. And especially the sort of demographics most of them lived, where they lived around a lot of their family members, and their family members knew a lot of non-related people in those towns, all the way to, like you're saying, 2024, a child who's, 5 to 8 years old, highly mobile families. Maybe they've never even been to the graveyard that their family members are actually buried in, and everything in between, right? So this is a lot of talking past each other generationally is very possible. And so I think it's good to start sociologically with that sort of landscape. On top of this, if you're asking, what does this have to do with Catholic social teaching? Like, point to the principle that it's, like the 7 normal ones, as it were, that this deals with. It very firmly point to God's preferential option for the poor. And that's weird for us, right? Because we think economically, right? What do you mean? The poor, some of the people who are dead, but they had a lot of money. They have really big tombstones. But as Flannery O'Connor named one of her stories, you can't be poorer than dead. And so the unborn, we rightfully will sometimes in Catholic world talk about being especially vulnerable and poor in resources, right? Like they don't even have a voice literally, but the dead don't either. And so until we start to think about that death is the great equalizer where your bank account goes to zero, your voice is mostly vanquished, perhaps what you've read, and of course people who are more famous, their memories might be more in our living memory, like not denying like inequalities that way. But you start to see as death, the great equalizer, sort of lands this question at the feet of any society. These dead who are now the poorest of the poor, what will you do on their behalf? So I actually think the sociological reality you're speaking to, which makes this very pertinent to anyone today, matches up with God's preferential option for the poor, which is, Bud, where did he show his preferential option for the poor in one way we never think about? When he went to hell and harrowed it and brought people out of the grave. They were the poorest people because they were in hell, or at least limbo. We don't have to get into that argument, right? So, of course, he had a preferential option for like the materially poor who were alive at the time. But if you don't care for the dead in the sort of most vulnerable state a human can be in, dead, that their money can do them no good, how are you going to be there for the rest of God's preferred vulnerable? And so I think that's the Catholic social principle linked up with the sociological reality you talk about that we need to think about today.
Yeah, and really living well as a Catholic means living faithfully means listening well to the voice of the dead. Like in many ways, the way that we think about tradition is like it's laying aside the hubris of thinking that we're in control of our own destinies and realizing that to live well, we have to be attentive to the voice of those who have gone before us. And I just feel, Bo, like there are so many ways where we've forgotten that piece of life, but also, so like we were talking at the introduction to the show about bioethics. Like another thing that we speak about with our students is that ethics so often is framed as like, how do I handle these really tough, challenging dilemmas? And we were kind of joking about that in the intro to the show. Really, the foundation of the moral life begins with internalizing certain habits. And you see this a lot when we get into this discussion. And this is where the month of November and thinking intentionally about honoring the dead is so important. So like even sort of like what you might see as like silly or mundane practices. So when I was a kid, we're walking down the sidewalk and we would say things like, don't step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. And then that would get
the science on that's unfounded, by the way.
We'll do another show on that later. Like when you that got extended, like when you entered a cemetery, like this kind of instinctual sense, like where you don't walk on gravestones, and those things that like those kind of habits that we take for granted. it really is like, we could go back into the mist of history and try to discern like where they arose and how they developed. But it's trying to inculcate this sense of like, just because a human being has passed doesn't mean that you can totally like disregard that person or, like show no honor to their body. Christianity has had all sorts of ways to honor even dead bodies. You see this especially like in the Christian East. But like as those habits have waned, again, I've talked to students and they've told me like the first time they sort of kind of questioned the status quo is like they had a loved one who passed, and maybe like a company who was responsible for organ donation came into the room shortly after the death and kind of talked about their loved one as if it was sort of like a treasure chest of disposable parts or like parts that could be utilized and even profited from. And they felt at that moment like something had gone wrong, something had gone awry. And we could say like drilling down deeper into that, like the thing that had gone awry probably could be traced back further than just like once we got in that conversation. The habits that would create respect within the context of that conversation had been lost.
No, that's a perfect description of the thread line I think we're trying to get at here. Because on one hand, we want to say that this is not a secret show where we say don't do organ donation, but organ donation is precisely one of those situations in the moral life where there is a lot on the line, all sorts of directions, and we don't get a lot of practice making those sort of decisions. And when we hear it, people really do try to make it act like it's a very easy thing. You'll be dead. What's the deal? And so this sort of uneasiness and it's not uniform, but the vast majority of students we've talked to, they worry the minute you start talking about a human that is not even completely dead, right? Like at this point, usually a human has not been declared dead. And they felt uneasy about all of a sudden this person who they are already entering the first stages of grief for, even though, yes, for a wonderful reason about why the people are pressing this issue, have now all of a sudden seen them as amalgamated parts that can do good for others. Again, I don't want you to go cancel your card necessarily about being an organ donor, but precisely this shows that unless you have a society that is sort of refulgent with habits about caring for people and the bodies they once inhabited even though they were dead, you do start to worry about how easy it is for this to sort of run rampant or for people to not put up the right type of resistance. Again, not necessarily being just curmudgeonly or that like all technology is bad, but if we're in the long habit of regarding the dead with some sort of regard, with some sort of respect, we enter into those difficult conversations, I think, with a lot more levity, right? Like we feel like we have a sort of comportment toward the dead where we will make good decisions even in tough times, about what it would mean to respect the body, but actually help save a life through organ donation. But if you don't have that, if you don't have a long life of habit of caring for the dead, that moment will surprise you big time. And that is a political moment. Because although at the doctor asking you right then about what you're going to do with organ donation, but we've been voting on these sort of things about organ donation and euthanasia, and you start to see all of these big hot button political issues that really do have this sort of thread back to, have you been to graveyards regularly as a child? Do you believe the dead have a place in your life? You don't even have to be a Christian or someone who believes in an afterlife for the idea that you have a respect for those who came before by proximity to their bodies, or at least a place where their bodies were buried, that would be a huge habit to have when it comes to these political questions that govern end-of-life decisions that we've had many states voting on here in the last few decades.
Yeah, this is going to start sort of up here, but I'm going to try to put some traction to what I say. So, like, at Vatican II, Council mid-20th century, there was what was called this ressourcement movement. Is really a movement on the part of theologians to recover things that have been sort of lost in the Catholic faith. So they would say, like, look, a lot like seminarians and priests and things as they study, they kind of go back to the Middle Ages, but there are these great resources from the first few centuries of the church that we sort of have lost sight of. I think you can also apply this idea in sort of how Catholics in the pews think about their relationship to the dead. So, I mean, this is painting with very broad strokes, but like historically, and here's something that we can think about recovering. When a Catholic loved one died, there was these devotions and practices around the funeral where it was like, we're really going to pray that God would show mercy on this person's soul. And like, we loved this person who's passed, but we recognize that like maybe at the moment of death, they weren't ready to be in the presence of God. So there was this kind of like really lively sense of like this person maybe like passing through purgatory, needing further purgation, and like we're going to remember them each year and make sacrifices on their behalf. Today, again, painting with broad strokes, we tend to like the funeral services a lot of times are more about a celebration of the person's life. And I've even heard priests kind of joke about like a canonization can kind of take place at Uncle Ed's funeral or whoever it happens to be. I think there's maybe a balance there, but if we can sort of like go back and resource or draw upon these traditions around purgatory, around our prayer for the faithful departed, I think it can help us to understand like our own station in life, but it also is a form of evangelism. What I mean by that, Bo, is like a lot of times like we kind of start with, well, like there's less of a sense of God in our culture. And so we kind of like in apologetics and evangelization, like we sort of like try to convince people like, oh, there is a God. There's this powerful being who exists up there. But really, I think the way we can kind of like communicate the reality of God working in the world is precisely through this like understanding of the communion of saints, this lively sense that the universe is populated, like there are angels around us. We're relying on the intercession of the saints. We're remembering the faithful departed. Because if you kind of have this sort of like, the image I have in mind is like an empty universe, and then you try to jump to belief in God, you know, like you've kind of like, you've skipped some steps. Whereas like we've drawn a lot on John Henry Newman on the show. He kind of in his time before he became Catholic, he was really impressed. Like he talked about real versus, oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank. What was the notional?
Yes.
Yeah. Real versus notional sin. And he said like, but as I was moving in the Catholic Church, Catholics had this sense like the Blessed Virgin Mary, she wasn't just like a historical figure in the past. She was this real like person who God had used and was continuing to use in people's lives. And we've got to recover some of that.
Well, I think to go to your point, this is another one where it might sound like I'm going far afield, but it matches back up with what you're saying. I think how you treat the dead goes to show you what you are planning to do with the living. And I'm not going to name particular cemeteries. I think nearly anyone who can go to a big town, big enough to have like 3 cemeteries, can see how we have dealt with the dead, and now how we, back then and now, also is going to show how we have ended up dealing with the living. If you go to the older cemetery in your town, I'm going to guess absolutely none of the roads are straight. They go up and down hills. There's people who actually go jog in these cemeteries. Why? Because it's sort of workout, it's peaceful, and, you know, but it looks like what you see old European cities looking like, right? Up on this hill, and, you know, nothing is like in complete squares, and you sort of see this the geography of the history of that town. They have different sections. They have different sort of time periods. You start to see that how the gravestones look change over time. And the idea, right, is the dead are the most important part of this. We'll build the roads so you can get to these places. The roads are almost uniformly small and very twisty. But the idea is the dead belong in these hills, and the cemeteries follow the warp and weft of the ground. And they're beautiful before you even consider the gravestones. If you go look at a modern cemetery, they will absolutely be in squares. They will be, the roads start to seem like the most important part, bud. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Making sure that the dead get in line. It's funny how even when they're dead, we're going to queue them up. And you start to think, oh my goodness, even in death, it's like they're waiting for their Starbucks or like, you know, to get their number called. And you start to realize that if there's this idea that we can take time to stop for the dead, we can walk up and down hills, we can drive slow on windy roads, we can take our time for the dead, versus we are going to make even the dead efficient. But those are 2 radically different views of the universe. And if you're going to treat your dead like that, how are you going to treat people? Are you going to act like the world can actually slow down for the sake of people, that there is actually warp and weft of a community, that even its changes over time can sort of make a narrative sense that they can fit in together as diverse as they are? Or are you going to streamline everything, plow everything flat, make the road square, and say, hey, buddy, if you want to rest in eternal life, you better get with the program? What is that going to say about the collectivization of those who are alive? And remember, that's not just sort of the state government doing that. That is people doing that of their own accord in modern cemeteries. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We are talking about a very lively topic. Bad dad joke. We're talking about the dead. It is November after all. But we are very much talking about the dead in light of their place in Catholic social teaching. We've been talking about the sociology of it quite a bit, about the history of how we deal with death has changed in time in the United States. We've seen this with our students, for instance, in the habits of how we care or think about the dead, giving us the foundation for how we're going to behave towards those who are alive. But one more time to make this very clear that this has a direct arrow to a Catholic social teaching. The teaching is the preferential option for the poor. And again, the Flannery O'Connor story, you can't be poorer than dead, is absolutely true. The poverty of the dead, but I think is something that people leave out. It makes sense to me, and like we have to tip our hats to an article we always have people read when we bring up this subject, Joseph Bottom's Death in Politics, that appeared many moons ago in First Things. But that article, that essay, starts off with a very jarring fact that the city of San Francisco removed all of the human remains, at least most of them. There's a few historical ones left, but moved all of their graveyards outside of city limits so that they were in the suburbs. And his question was, what do you do with a town or city that's hundreds of years old that has no dead people in it? And his point was, throughout history, that would have been unimaginable. They would have thought it was like a nomadic tent city or something like that. And then, I mean, he gets very archaeological like that. The first cities really are nomadic peoples of various groups sort of deciding to have a common burial ground, and that's where they always come back to, and eventually cities seem to have emerged from the common burial of different tribes together, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that we're getting at is, if you can't see the dead as existing, so if you don't see them as existing at all, they don't have a poverty. They're just gone. But if we believe the dead are impoverished because they no longer are alive, and again, I'm going to argue you can think about this even if you don't believe in an afterlife, but certainly if you do, this is the case. But if you believe the dead have a place in the civic body, you certainly believe that they have a diminished one because they can't speak for themselves. They can't even move. Wherever they're at unless you move them. And I hope people start to see that in their poverty, if we can't treat them well, then how are we going to treat the disabled? How are we going to treat the unborn or children? How are we going to treat the stranger? How are we going to treat those who are in need? Because on one hand, Bud, the dead are the most impoverished, but also they're the easiest impoverished to take care of, right? Like they're not constantly batting down your door, at least physically, asking for help. They just need a place to rest and you to care for them. And so there's this real litmus test, right? That if a society can't take care of its poorest, the dead, who are also not demanding of you as much as like a child would be on a day-to-day basis, how are you going to be expected to care for the vulnerable among the living?
I was really sort of moved or taken by the last example you were giving in the first segment about how we design our cemeteries. A similar idea came up to me recently. So at the All Souls liturgy that I went to, there was the priest had arranged a catafalque to be placed near the sanctuary. So this is like a casket that basically during the All Souls Mass, it's front and center. There's not a body inside of it, but it calls to mind the faithful departed, and I think our own mortality. And one of the MC had said to me, like, well, when we have the catafalque at this church, like it sometimes can get in the way. And he said, as they're processing or different parts of the mass, like for the servers and things, it's difficult because the catafalque is like right there front and center. And it's kind of large, and the church is designed in such a way that it's in the way. And I thought, like, that's kind of great because, in a sense, this one day out of the year where, in a particular way, the liturgy is oriented to remembering the faithful departed, they're quote unquote in the way. And we have to slow down and kind of like rearrange how we celebrate the liturgy to take into account that fact.
The Hispanic population at my church here in Christ the King in Des Moines, the ofrenda does that, right? So like the altar of the dead is, I think somehow it's rendered in English. But the idea, right? Like, and something that's ancient and ever new, right? So it's this ancient custom, but because of modern photography, you look over and all of a sudden there's sort of this like choir of countless the loved ones who, like you said, you start to realize, oh my goodness, they actually are watching us, right? And to your point, you have to rearrange the sanctuary to say, we know the dead are with us.
Yeah, and so when we, again, I know we're talking about Catholic social teaching. I've brought up bioethics a couple times. In class, when we get into care for those who are dying, this is one of the most contested areas in bioethics today, in part because of the technologies that we've developed that can sort of like sustain life longer than we were able to in the past. And I've talked to students, I've talked to friends too, like they have this like good impulse. What I mean by that, like it's driven by good intentions, but they'll say like, when I'm in the final stages of my life, I don't want to be a burden to my family. I'm stealing from you a bit here, Bo, but like what we try to sometimes impress on the students is that like it's actually a moral achievement to be a burden to your loved ones. And in our social context, we've tried to sort of like relieve ourselves of the burden of those who are dying. And that kind of impulse has in a lot of ways driven some of the more unfortunate ways in which we care, don't care for those who are dying. We're like, how do we get to the point where we can consonants like euthanasia, where it's become more widespread in cultures like Belgium. And it's really this sense of like, well, we don't want the dying to be a burden upon us. Well, I think back to in the Old Testament, like when the prophets and others talk about the glory of God, the term they use there is kavod. And it actually is the same word for Matthew Umbarger, our good friend, might correct me on this, but it's like, it means like the weight of God, like God's holiness, God's presence has this kind of weightiness to it. I would say it's similar with the dead. Like they have this weightiness. And if you've ever tried to pick up a dead body or carry a casket, like in a particular way that's
dead
the case.
Yeah.
But when we try to throw that off, forget about it, unburden ourselves from it, it leads us down some very dangerous tracks, I think.
No, I think this is the great political obligation of the dead, is to make us slow down. Like you said, they can't help but be in the way unless this is why burning them. So not to get into the whole arguments about cremation, but I will say this I will say, controversial as it is, the great condemnation of our society towards the dead is a lot of people choose cremation because it's so expensive to bury a body. Most people that I think cremate people don't necessarily want to. It's all they can afford. If you have a society where people have to incinerate a body rather than bury it because it's too expensive, that is a condemnation against that society. I will say that. Shots fired. The other thing that I'll say, right, is unless you want to just burn or mass grave, like you start to think about all the things totalitarian regimes do with the dead to make them be forgotten. Part of that, and I understand why people like hold on to this memory thing, but in the grand scheme of things, most dead people are forgotten. So sometimes I think that like rings a bit hollow with people. The only memory, right, would be God's memory eternal in God. However, the obligation we have for them to be in the way a bit, I think it is we've talked about this in other classes we've taught. What's in downtowns? And we said churches used to be in downtowns, and now mostly it's economic centers. Well, graveyards used to be downtown. And the fact that we keep moving them outside because we're like, well, downtown, that's prime real estate. But what does it mean if a society goes, you know what, it's worth our dead having prime real estate? Certainly that means that we have different, not obligations, but that we have different concerns, that we have different goals, that we value things different than ones who want to remove the dead because they're non-productive. And that's it, right? So Jesus will say the Sabbath was made for man and not man for Sabbath. But if that goes for Sabbath, it even more doubly goes for the rest of the work week. The work week was made for man, not man for the work week. And the dead, in their great last job that they get to do for a society, is to remind us you'll die someday and be unproductive. So productivity for a society can't be the main thing in life. And if we take that lesson that the dead teach us, that someday you will be made to slow down, you will be unproductive, you will not move on your own. If we take that serious, we start to go, do we make our society where unproductive members can be taken care of then too? Or are we all going to treat ourselves as utilitarian instruments to a machine, to an economy, when death proves to us that can't be what we are ultimately for?
Man, there's so much to say here. I'm kind of like, I'm struggling over like what to land on because I feel like there are so many things that we've talked about in class that are coming to the surface with this conversation. I'm really glad you picked it for today. One is you just mentioned that like one of the purposes of the dead is to slow us down. I feel like it's the same way too with all of the most vulnerable in our society. So infants operate in the same manner. And until like in my life, until I had a child for the first time, it's like you've got this sense you're going through life and it's all about efficiency and productivity and achieving certain things. And then there's this crying little vulnerable human being and like its needs are so prescient and immediate. Like you really can't just go back to work the next day.
Right.
And really once a loved one starts to, if they enter like a terminal stage or whatever, that slows you down in a certain way too. And it also gives you like a kind of perspective that you didn't have before that event.
Yeah, the vulnerables are prophets, like not PRO, They are prophets who are witnessing to a deeper reality in their vulnerability.
I mentioned in the intro this kind of conversation that we had with prospective students. And one thing that I started out with is like, how do you judge the excellence of a society or an organization or a person? And there's a temptation sometimes to boil that down to like just numbers, like maybe the profit margins of a business. But most of us, like if we try to be morally serious, we say like, well, that hospital can't be judged just on the basis of how much money it made, or that person is more than their 401k. As a society, like I think about this even with the recent election and the kind of like conversation and debates that we have. Sometimes I worry that it's like we sort of we judge our society on the base of like economic productivity, but like how great would it be if we say like, well, we're a blue ribbon society and we're going to hang our hat on how we treated or how we cared for the least of these. That's terribly unproductive. There's going to be a lot of inefficiencies, but there's something to be said for that. And there's something to be said for that even beyond the level of just like, well, it's the right thing to do. In class, sometimes we've had students like read or we've dabbled in the work of Alistair McIntyre. And he built on Aristotle. Aristotle said human beings fundamentally are rational animals. And McIntyre pointed out, like, beyond that, we're also dependent rational animals. And our dependency is sometimes scary, but it's also like, it's our strength. It's what gives us the sense that like life can't be boiled down to the survival of the fittest. And if we enter into that sort of cycle, like there is a way in which we'll devour ourselves.
And I mean, in two senses, so not everyone's familiar with this, but more and more people are familiar with this idea of memento mori, that of course the saints have always said, remember that you will die. Stoics say this. There's a lot of people, like even pagans, who get this, but of course Christians have always been rowdy about this. Remember your death, that you will die, you'll have a fight. This is the four last things. But notice that a lot of that is usually thinking about your death. Remember you are going to die and you'll live a good life. But I think just as important is memento mortuorum, remember the dead. That if you can't remember that there are others who have died, and then, like you said, are these prophetic witnesses to your future, you will be like me. But also, I hadn't thought about it until today. It's so easy to forget the dead because they can't call and remind you. but it's also really easy to just do right by them. It really is. Like you go and you pray for them, you visit them, especially in November, right? And then you keep alive whatever flames of love that they have made in your heart, right? Physically, right? It's one of the easiest things to do. It's literally free half the time to honor the dead, but it's also so easy. And so it is really this testament to a person and a society. It really is practice at living well with the living. Catholicism will get accused of being a death cult. And I think that's some of the prayers for the dead and stuff like this and the Protestant Reformation, and then, just some of the ways that it gets rendered in the modern world. This is all like, spooky, scary stuff, and Catholics get this wrong, and, they're mystified and all these things like this. I actually think this is sort of the practice that you go, what's practices that you can do with your child that will make them more kind and understanding towards others? And you go, make them have a lively sense of the dead and our obligations towards them. Because if you can't even care for the dead, how are you going to care for a human? And if we can't understand the witness the dead give us about this life and the sort of gaining notoriety or using people, that all of this will come to nothing, we're going to mistreat the most vulnerable in society. And so I think that is the thing that we keep coming back. That God's preferential option for the poor starts with the fact that he cared for us who were dying and would go to the grave, and then there would be no praising him in Sheol, right? That's like one of the Psalms. And God loved the poor in death so much, he came to die for us and drag us out of hell. And then that poverty extended to everything else. So I think that, it's a mesmerizing thing that you can take to heart if you allow it.
When I was growing up, evangelical pastors would talk about how they wanted the preaching to be relevant. And sometimes even in the sermon, they would step back and say, like, so what's the takeaway? And I think with this show, if you're listening, like one takeaway could be, as Catholics, we should continue to commission sacred art that incorporates these elements. And, it's easy to fall into like, well, things used to be great, now they're not so great now. That's not what I intend with this next comment. But I do think if you sort of analyze or look at sacred art as it appeared in churches like, say, the Middle Ages go into the early modern era, then a lot of the churches that you see today, even in our art as Catholics, there was a livelier sense of death and judgment. And like you visit Europe, and there are so many frescoes and things that remind folks of the final judgment. Sometimes it can get really metal. So there's a chapel in Italy. I didn't do the research before the show. I forget the town. But the part of the portico or the entryway into the church is actually designed from skulls and bones. And there's this message. I don't have the Latin memorized, but it's basically like, as you're walking in, it says, where you are, I once was. Where I am, you soon shall be. Remember, O mortal, that you shall die. And, like for us today, that sort of takes us back a bit, but again, it's kind of it's cultivating this sense, this kind of like it's reminding us that history can't be like kind of like distilled down to just this present moment. And we all, the psalmist reminds us like our own lives, they have this quickness to them that's difficult to sense when you're young, but that you start as you age, like me, you start to get a livelier and livelier sense of, and yet we've lost that. And so if someone who's listening wants to commission a painting like that for the chapel at Mercy College of Health Sciences, 6th Avenue.
Hey-o.
We're taking donations.
I like that. Also to get into sort of practical, what's the payout? You need to vote like you will die someday and that everyone you love will too. You should participate in civic life as if all of this will go away. And that's not nihilistic. It only is that way if you don't believe the dead if you disregard the dead as having a ongoing presence in civic life. If you believe the dead do, and that we have obligations towards them, all of a sudden when you vote as if you will die, your family will die, everyone you love will die, even your enemies will die, when you start to have that in mind, it's not to say nothing matters, it's to say all of us are poor, all of us come from a poverty and will end in that poverty. And then when we talk about God's preferential option for the poor, it stops being like, oh, well, this is like Nietzsche says, right? This is Catholics just getting the resentful to fall behind them, so that like the people who actually are winners and do stuff well, will take their stuff. This is to admit not only that we are born and shall go into a poverty, but the power of that poverty, right? What does St. Paul say? That we have a strength and a weakness in our weaknesses that we'll never know. Foremost in grace, right? That when we abandon our sort of self-understanding as self-sufficient, we can then live in the grace and love of Christ, which is everlasting. But even in human terms, again, our strength has always been as a species, the weakness of our children demanding that we come together in community. But I also want to argue that it was our strength in coming together to honor the dead. And we have political life because of that impulse. And the dead do not stop teaching us just because they don't happen to be here on this mortal coil with us at the same time. May they have eternal rest. May they rest in peace. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. I know some people might think talking about death during November is macabre. However, I feel like the world is more full in November, and we take the time to stop and go pray with our children at graveyards and things like this. When I finally became Catholic, and this idea that these people are alive in the Lord, in some way, we don't have to get into the destination of each soul in a graveyard, but I started to feel like I belonged on this earth and in this world in a way which is different than if the world is just this big yawning chasm of nothingness, and maybe there's a big frightening God on the other side or not. No, this civic life that we live, even beyond the years that we're here, I hope that's something that people take away from this show.
Well, we always have a lot of fun recording the show. I really enjoyed today's episode. We were talking in studio recently, and Aiden, who works there now, he was showing me some of the numbers with our podcast, and it was interesting to see which shows got the most hit. For instance, our one recently on the preferential option for the poor was quite popular. And I guess
thank you, poor people.
Those things intrigue us. If you do want to ever reach out and give some feedback, we really enjoyed this one, you can do so. Contact at iowacatholicradio.com. You can head to iowacatholicradio.com. The email address and a contact form is right there. We'd love to hear from you. Please also join us in our prayer life. So the rosary is aired each day at 4:30 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 p.m. You can also pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy with us at 3:56 in the afternoon, or use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
I thought you were going to say we'd be at a particular graveyard and they could come talk to us then. There you go. That's what we should start to do. If you want to go do things around the diocese of Des Moines, but also just the greater Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, which is getting bigger every day, you can find out what's going on at iowacatholicradio.com on the events page. So, for instance, on December 6th in West Des Moines, Iowa, we are going to have the First Friday Mass. Join the Iowa Catholic Radio staff, family, and friends as we celebrate the First Friday Mass at our St. Gabriel the Archangel Chapel at the station. On December 13th at St. Francis of Assisi in West Des Moines, the Man Up Power Lunch featuring John Wynn. We know that guy. In a post-Christian world that champions new absolutes and shifting truths, Advent calls us to anchor ourselves in the enduring reality of the Incarnation. You will want to listen to John Wynn. He is always a barrel of fun. Also, March 1st at West Des Moines, St. Francis of Assisi, the Forge Conference. The Forge Conference 2025 tackles the threats facing modern manhood. More information on the events page. And then, of course, April 2nd, we've been talking about this leading up. We're going to have an evening with Father Mike Schmitz. Join the Iowa Catholic Radio Network as they invite you to an evening with Father Mike Schmitz as we embark on our 20th year of connecting listeners to Christ and His Church, wherever they may be on their faith journey. Sign up today to be notified when tickets go on sale. Again, you can do that at iowacatholicradio.com/events. Folks, please, as we get into the Advent season here pretty soon, the end of the liturgical year into Advent, please kindly contemplate, especially end-of-the-year donations, but continuing ones as well. This ministry is not simply the people behind the mics, behind the boards, and behind the desk. It is your ministry as well. You make it possible. You do that through your time, talent, and treasure, but very much so the material ways that you give gifts allow us to be on the air. Thank you for giving, and we hope that you keep on doing so. Bud, fantastic job. Like I said, very heartening episode for me here in the month of November.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That was fun.
Make sure to pray for the dead, Eternal rest grant to them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May their souls and the souls of all the faithful departed to the mercy of God rest in peace. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.